So we got a couple pictures here that Lynn's going to kind of narrate as I flip through from the recent deployment, so y'all kind of see what everything was.
So this picture is pulling into Victoria, Texas. This is about 2 hours after the eye of the hurricane, which got really close to Victoria, went through. We're pulling in. We're the first medical support going into Victoria after the hurricane struck. So that's the first thing we see when we pull into town. We're cruising along the highway probably about 40 miles an hour, and we've got that traffic light just kind of dangling in front of us. We kind of thought that was exciting to pull into. This is the hospital that we evacuated. There's about 100 patients, 120 patients that we emptied out of that hospital and moved to other areas. And there was several other parts of the hospital that had siding torn off and structural damage. They had no water at all, and when we first got there, they still had no electricity, so they were running on generators. Just some structural damage of some buildings and stuff that we saw coming into town. This was kind of an interesting picture because if you can zoom into it, one of the trees is blown over to the left and the other one is blown over to the right. So, you know, it kind of shows how the hurricane went through, and it blew one to one direction and one to the other. So they're laying, the tops are laying into each other. This is moving on over. We ended up going over towards Beaumont later on after we left Victoria, and this is just kind of some flooding we saw off of the highway. We moved into Beaumont just as soon as we could get highways open to go in. Once again, this is just kind of some flooding in the area. Some additional flooding. The little white spot you see beside the highway is a tractor trailer that attempted to go under an overpass, and it's pretty much about halfway underwater. This is the Highway 90, and we continued on down the highway. This is actually a 4-lane divided highway, which is now a 2-lane highway with all the traffic going in one direction. That's pretty self-explanatory for the John Deere dealership.
I bet you get a good deal on John Deere there.
Yeah, just some residences along the highway. Again, more pictures of just flooding. This was in Houston, where people had pulled over to the side of the road, and they had their little boats and anything they had with them, throwing them off the side of the road, jumping into them, going out to try to save people. This is the highway once again on the way to Beaumont. The water was probably about 6-8 inches deep. That was the clearest path that we could find to get down into Beaumont. So there's kind of another picture right there looking kind of out the window on the highway. The other lane was completely gone. So, but anyway, that's just a few pictures that we have.
So we're going to start talking about case review. We're going to start talking about drugs today. And we've had a lot of rash of illegal and prescription medications. We want to talk about how those are being treated in the field and the things that we're doing for those. So that's kind of, we're talking about more of altered mental status secondary to drug. Some of the things we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the basic understandings of some of the drugs that we're dealing with, legal and illegal. The effects on the body. We want to examine some patient care reports. So we've got 3 of those for specific overdoses. Follow up with the patient's outcome. We've got a really new way to do this. And something else we're going to start with the patient outcome is if you have an active STEMI, a VAN positive that ends up being an LVO, we're going to start doing before and after pictures of the cath lab for you. And we'll have a little certificate for you, and then you'll be able to see those. So there's a follow-up so you can kind of see how they're being treated and what's going on. And then we want to take a closer look at the lesser-known prescriptions, medications, and how they alter and what they're doing. So first of all, what's a drug? A drug is anything that makes a physiological change to our bodies, whether it's inhaled, smoked, injected, consumed, absorbed by a patch, or dissolved underneath the skin. Now, we have had certain calls where they're taking now the skin patches and they're sucking on the fentanyl. That's kind of been a big hot thing because they're getting the whole dose very quickly, which a lot of times is CNS depressant going to end up with that being death if it's not caught. So at this moment, every one of us is being affected by what a drug would do to somebody. We naturally have that in our body. And yes, you sit right here. For example, anandamide, it activates the endocannabis system in your body. And so already right now you're saying, I'm kind of hungry, or this also affects a runner's high. Now, I really don't know what a runner's high is because I don't run, thank you, but I know what a buffet high is, and that's and meat sweat, so it's probably close to the same thing. Is that right, Alan? Okay, I just don't run, so I figured we'd ask somebody that was fairly healthy. We're feeling a small part of this throughout the day, and that has a lot of the same effects as THC does, or one of the cannabises that's in marijuana. Now, we're going to talk a lot about cannabis here in just a little bit, but as what this does over time is it starts to overactivate these things. That's why you get the munchies post smoking too much weed. You know, we don't think about tobacco as being a drug, but it is. And unfortunately, now we kind of we're starting to see, we're getting into that time of year where we're going to start seeing a lot of our respiratory patients. Most of those are have emphysema, COPD, and what do they continue to do? Smoke every day, and a lot of times with oxygen in. Then when we talk about how much chemical is in one cigarette, once it's lit, 7,000 chemicals go into the body. Some of those being multiple different ways, because when it starts to burn, it's inhaled, it changes its properties. But these addictive properties, some of them come from the things that are added in intentionally into a cigarette. So we're going to talk about some of those things. So first of all, ammonia. Ammonia helps nicotine be absorbed quicker. So therefore, cigarettes have ammonia in them. Hundreds of different additives, but at the same time, it changes the flavor of the smoke, something like methanol. And so this is something that gets absorbed, and people think, oh, that tastes pretty good in a cigarette, but it's added in. And last but not least, the paper itself is treated in order to slow the burn down of a cigarette. So in 1994, cigarette manufacturers were made to start listing everything that's in cigarettes, and it ended up being 599 different chemicals. Now, once those chemicals get lit, they combine with other chemicals, they make certain compounds. That's how we end up with 7,000 at the end of the day. While raisin juice and nutmeg may sound very good in a cigarette, that's not all that's in there. There's a lot of other different components. Once again, take ammonia. This is the number one thing that we clean with, and it's in cat urine, and it's in your cigarettes. We start talking about urea. Not only just the cats, but everybody produces urine, and that's part of urea. It's also in your cigarettes on a daily basis. And then you have a lot of different forms of herbicide that starts to kick in that's in that, and you light it, burn it, and then you're inhaling that. So then we move into our vaping and e-cigarettes, because everything's being sold as, well, this doesn't light on fire, it's not combustible at that point, so the e-cigarette is better. Well, there's not just a lot known about e-cigarettes, except for most of the products still contain nicotine, and we know that's just as addictive as cocaine and heroin is. But at the same time, is what it does is it releases that dopamine sensor that's in our body, and that's that reward transmitter, reward that says, okay, I've done good, so I get to have this. As part of that, nicotine, once again, is still in this, along with a lot of these are oil-based products. Now, as what we do know is that these oil-based products are not good over time. They had an incident, we had a call a while back with a gentleman, a young man that had been vaping for a fairly long period of time. He ended up passing. During that autopsy, they were able to literally squeeze those lungs, and oil was able to drip out. Is what they're finding is, even with CPAP, we're not able to blow that out of the way in order to start that oxidization process. So you're getting, you can ventilate them. We're ventilating them. We're pushing the air in. But that's not saying we're oxygenating, because those oil molecules are taking over the alveolar sacs, and they're not allowing for gas exchange. So some of the major transmitters that cigarettes and nicotine affects, once again, is dopamine. That's our reward pathway. No different than cocaine, ecstasy, anything else that we have. You also have serotonin. This is my well-being and my happiness. This is what allows me to sleep. And allows me to get rest, and also allows me to feel good about what I've done. And this also, many antidepressants prevent this uptake, and serotonin is one of those. Norepinephrine, this is what my alertness, this is what gives me that feeling of I need to flight or flight, and no different than when amphetamines may stimulate the release of both norepinephrine and dopamine within the brain, so they're falsely making a false feeling that I'm doing good. So we're going to start off looking at this 150 kilo patient, about in her 60s or so. She's in a protective residential facility. Now, this was not a group home, this was not an MHR facility. It's what this patient, so fairly large patient, but as you can see, chronic back pain. When you start seeing chronic back, chronic pain, lower extremities, what do you start thinking about? They're constantly taking those medications, and so they're probably heavily medicated. She bent over to pick something up, so she fell forward, struck her head, and hit the floor. She was unsure if she lost consciousness, but during the transport started admitting to taking 10 milligrams of oxycodone, or Oxycontin for her pain and knee pain. So you've already kind of coming in, so we're adding a fall in here, but she's bending over, so you wouldn't think that's a big fall. So you're thinking now she's altered mental status, and we've got to start dealing with what's what here. So they found out the patient was on the floor. She was disoriented on arrival. EMS called her by name, and she was in and out of consciousness. Respirations were shallow, around 8 breaths per minute. And so are we thinking, is this a fall from bending over and picking something up? Probably not. So you got to have that high suspicion that this is something a lot more. As you can see, respirations were very shallow. What's the number reason we're going to use Narcan? It's only for respiratory compromise, to see if this is one of those areas. We did have a little bit of minor bleeding. She did have a small cut on the right temporal area, so you can't rule out that we do have a head injury. What about if she was on blood thinners? You've got to kind of weigh that and all that, add all that together. So fire arrived on scene, pulses were 62, saturations initially 74. Great job getting her on oxygen very quickly to get that supplemental. Could that cause our altered mental status? You bet it could. But why was she so suppressed with her respiratory cycle? They took precautions once again with their C-spine and got her on the heart monitor as soon as they could. And initial blood pressure 100/65, and you would think if we had a TBI here, so if we had a head injury, what's that going to do to pressure most of the time? It's going to elevate it, drive it forward, so they have that perfusion. Pupils were constricted bilaterally here, and so this is a big part. They got the oxygen saturations up, but the respiration still continued to be really slow. So you're thinking, I've probably got something going on that's happening. And then we got an IV established. They got the 12 lead in place, start ruling things out. And then they elected to go with the Narcan. Now, they did a great job. How many times do you just push to a Narcan? We do that pretty haphazardly, I would say, a lot of times. But this crew had a very good job of knowing she was a chronic patient. She was chronically on those meds, and so they elected to go ahead with just one for inadequate respirations. Due to decrease, there was really no change at that point, so they elected to go ahead and give another one. And they did have an increase at this point. So they met that threshold of where that narcotic was getting absorbed, and then finally they can say, okay, so we did have some improvements, so now you're thinking constriction, slow respirations, Narcan's working, where are you going? She's probably an overdose at this point. During transport, she was given a Narcan with a desired effect, and respirations and mental status improved. So it did a very good job documenting where they were headed. Not a lot of change with blood pressure, respirations once again came up. Then she got nauseated. What's one of the side effects of Narcan that we don't always think about? It's nausea. Okay, that could happen at that point from that withdrawal state, especially on these chronic patients. So we were able to get them on some Zofran, relieve that nausea and vomiting was relieved at that point. Then her respiration started to go back down again. And so you don't have a long time with your Narcan, and that's what they saw here. So within about 5 minutes, she was starting to slow back down, and so you decrease, so they went ahead and gave some more Narcan and improved that once again. Not really any change in blood pressure. Once again, they did a good job. What is this saving you? That's saving you from a legal standpoint, showing them that I do have end titles, she is breathing, and I have proven that by the gold standard. So very nice job with showing that process. Once again, increased respirations and mental status. So let's follow up at the hospital. Responsiveness continued to waver. They did a CT scan, labs, all the good stuff. Didn't find really anything. And her urine drug screen was negative for opioids. How often do you see that? And you know you've given them something. Often. Yeah. And so we think, well, they did a UDS, and we know she's on Oxycontin at home. It can still test negative. And so just always remember that kind of in the back of your mind. How many times you go to the doctor's office, the UDS is negative. That doesn't always mean that that's always the case. We still can have that going on.
Just a quick comment. So remember that the typical, we gather urine in the ER and we send it to the lab. essentially are using like dip strips to decide are they positive or negative. If you're doing like an actual drug test for a job or something, they actually do a gas, whatever, spectroscopy, something or another. That's more specific. So the urine drug screen, you know, it's a screen, right? So it's not, it doesn't approach, it approaches 100%, but it's going to miss it occasionally. The gold standard, that gas, whatever it is, that is going to pick it up every time. But we don't do that because it costs a lot and it takes a lot of time, and we don't always need to know 100% if they have that.
So once she got to the hospital, she admitted through a psychiatric consult that she was on lithium, which is a mood stabilizer. She was on Wellbutrin. She was on Klonopin, once again, for depressive drug, and then amitriptyline. And so you've got a lot of different psychiatric meds, but then again, she didn't admit to the Oxycontin again. And so that's where you're getting that constriction. So let's talk about lithium real quick, because I actually learned quite a bit about that. You know, you see people all the time on lithium. Lithium has been used for decades. Sometimes they said it's really good drug, other times they say it's not so hot. However, it is a decent mood stabilizer, especially for bipolar disorders. And so what this does is it appears that several neurotransmitters, including glutamate, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Lithium can reach toxic levels, though, very quickly, and it has a very short half-life. Many times this drug is taken in small doses throughout the day. The renal system processes lithium much like sodium ion does. So if they get dehydrated and they're sparing a lot of sodium, their lithium level is probably going to be off at that point. But one of the biggest things is diarrhea and tremors were also said about 2 days earlier, and this is one of the big things that it can do is it can cause the diarrhea and tremors. And I've got to thinking how many times I've seen people on lithium and they say, well, I've been shaking really bad the last couple of days. They're toxic on it at that point. So that's what they admitted her for. So she was diagnosed with encephalopathy from toxicity of her lithium concentrate. She was taken off the lithium medication, and her other medicines were adjusted, and the home or the protective residential area was refusing to take her back because she had fallen a couple of times, and she was rehabbed to a nursing facility.
All right, so I think Chad kind of mentioned that, you know, good job on not just slamming that Narcan. I know in the past, a lot of times it's, well, let's wait till we're backing up to the ER and let's give them all of it, and the patient's going crazy. So, you know, we really want to kind of titrate that to breathing, which I think this crew did a good job at, and continued watching that and gave more doses, smaller doses as it's needed. Kind of mentioned Narcan's quick on, right? I mean, we've all seen it, the patient's almost dead, you give them a little Narcan and they wake. But they can go right back to that state in just a few minutes. Lithium. So everybody in here is probably seen patients on lithium. It's one of the really, really old drugs. It works really good as a mood stabilizer, especially for bipolar. But the problem is patients can be very sensitive to it. Certainly as they get older and more comorbidities, it's a lot harder to keep them in a normal range of it. And then also, these patients are susceptible to overdose and taking too much of their medications, sometimes intentionally, but also just unintentionally and accidentally taking extra doses. So you can have an increased lithium level. And we talked about, you know, kind of GI upset's the most common, but as it gets higher, we get altered mental status. And like most overdoses, it's really supportive care, you know, even to the point if they need intubated because they can't maintain their airway, and just give it time. It's renally excreted, so we make sure they're well hydrated, so you're making them pee and get that fluid through. You can't actually do dialysis and take it off if somebody was to take like an entire bottle of lithium or what have you and have really crazy high doses. You would probably move towards dialysis. That's all I got on that.
Any questions? First case, okay. All right, so let's talk about methamphetamines. Continues to be a problem, unfortunately. Meth is an upper and it creates a false sense of well-being. So these folks will a lot of times smoke this meth. They go on these binges, and this is a prolonged event, lasts 24 to 72 hours. The crash is very hard though, and sometimes this can last for months. And this is where we start seeing the hallucinations, the paranoia, insomnia, seizures, and can even up to death. You may see this sometimes even with permanent brain damage. And so you've seen these folks where they get to, we're going to break this down a little bit more, but you'll see them when they're having the hallucinations. You think, when's the last time did you smoke? And they're saying 5 days ago. Well, that's what this is this is part of that crash period. So you have pseudoephedrine. This is the most common ingredient. This is how meth is made. But it is also mixed with everything from battery acid to drain cleaner, ladder and fuel, anything they get their hands on to cook with. And they start this cooking process and they cook it down until they get that. So what are the stages of meth? We have the rush. This is where my blood pressure, my heart rate increases. This process lasts about 30 minutes. So if you get there and they're on meth and their blood pressure's through the roof, their heart rate's really high, what are you typically thinking? Synthetics at that point. But it could be methamphetamines in a very early stage. Then they move into the high. This is usually where they feel very aggressive, they're argumentative, and they think they're extremely intelligent. And how many times you sit there and argued with somebody on meth because they think they're a lot smarter than you? This process lasts anywhere between 4 and 16 hours. So this can last for a prolonged period of time. It's going to last, and it affects everybody differently. Then you start to move to the binge folks, and these are the folks that is taking more and more and more to get that high on a regular basis. So eventually the drug simply just doesn't work like it used to. I've had several drug users that are rehabbed have said, I've always been chasing that very first high and I can never get to it again. And so that's a lot of them will say that. Then we move to the tweaking portion, and this is typically a lot of times where EMS and fire gets called. You'll get there and they've got that twitch, you got their itching, they're craving different things, they're going insomnia. And as you can see, meth is very hard on your body, on the appearance, and we've seen those folks. Then the crash, this is a long period of sleep, your body's exhausted, it's running running multiple marathons. Once again, talk to somebody who runs, they can probably explain that to you. Then you have the meth hangover. This is where they're dehydrated, they haven't been eating, they haven't been sleeping, and they're exhausted, and this stage can last for several days. Then you have the withdrawal. So you've seen these folks come back to this, and one of the biggest things is they crave going back to that high again. And so you'll see this portion, this is where for months and months, they start to have suicidal thoughts and they're just not able to hold it together. So this is a 100-kilo man in his late 40s. That right there should tell you the older they are, probably the harder it's going to be on them. At late 40s, our heart and blood pressure is usually not as good as when we were in our 20s. So that's going to magnify that drug right there. It's going to be a lot harder. So this call was ran in one of our small communities. I can just say it's Slayton because it's already on the Slayton Police Department had got there. The man was now very combative. Incredible documentation, and I can't say this enough. We talked about this, but you can see that he was flailing, kicking, screaming, yelling obscenities, trying to fight the officers who were having to physically restrain him from running in front of cars and laying in the street. Family did a great job. They did a great job documenting this. Stated he'd been on a meth binge and hadn't slept for more than a couple of hours over the last 3 days. He stated that the family member stated that he was starting to threaten them to stab him, and he tried to stab one with a screwdriver. Officer stated that this was the third time that they had been called this morning, and the first time he had seen fine, quote unquote, and the second time he left the residence before they could get there. The third is when they found him running in and out of cars. So they've done a really nice job talking about setting that scene of, so where are we going with this guy? Y'all know where we're going with the ketamine. And so as part of that process, once again, they found face down, yelling, fighting officers, and then they started naming it 4 officers. I can't stress to you how good this documentation is of setting that scene of how many responders. They elected to go with the ketamine at this point. He was 100 kilos at 4 milligrams per kilo IM, which took about 5 minutes to calm him down, 10 minutes before he became completely calm. It's kind of unusual for ketamine. A lot of times, and one of the things is we're going to look at here is his heart rate, yes, is elevated. Did a great job, once again, proving that he was breathing the whole time. Yes, his saturations were low. They got him on oxygen. checked the glucose, and started with that process. Once again, got a large bore IV, started a fluid bolus as required with overdoses, and then oxygen came into play to start to bring that up. Blood pressure still stayed about the same, heart rate came down about 10 points, but his saturations came up once again, the gold standard, proving by end-tidal CO2 that he was breathing the whole time. Patient remained sedated, was beginning to flex his hands, move his feet, and open and close his eyes. So this ketamine, now how far do we have a transport from Slate? Will take y'all 27 minutes or so to get to the hospital. They did a really nice job documenting and then who was in the truck with them and what was going on. IV showing sinus tach. And they did a really nice job setting the scene. In the EC, he became very, very uncooperative once again, requested water to drink. More cooperative, and then requested water. The physician released his restraints, and then the fight was on. They ended up, once again, having to fight him back down. They give one of Ativan, then two of Ativan IM, did not sedate enough, and then they end up having to go with 200 more of ketamine. And so the fight was on. So at this point, this young man had had a lot of sedation medications. And as you can see, he continued. This may last once again up to 4 to 16 hours, and he had been on a binge. So there's no telling how long this is going to go on. So he was diagnosed with an amphetamine-induced psychosis once again, and had a severe ion gap acidosis. So they put him on Presidex drip, which is going to be very heavy sedative over time. And they're going to put him on a drip where they can keep him down for a long period of time. Moved him to the ICU, and then in the ICU, the fight was back on. They didn't keep him down. So once again, and they documented in their report, took 8 nurses and security to hold him down. Well, it took 4 of us to get him all really. I'm just joking, nurses, just joking.
So they weren't doing a good job of it.
Yeah, they're just not experienced fighting quite like we are. You get pretty good at it. And then he was put back in 4-point restraints, and then they added a drip of Versed with it. So not sure why they elected to go with Versed instead of ketamine. My opinion, ketamine would have been a lot better drug at that point. So after 3 days in the ICU, he finally became cooperative. He talked. There's that time period, that stretch. He used methamphetamines to help with his depression. That's a great depression drug. I haven't seen a doctor give it yet, but I hear it works real good. And that gives him the energy to get out of bed. So once he was in jail, he received some Lexapro for his depression, but it could not be attained while he was on parole. So he turned back to the non-doctor admitted methamphetamines. So that's kind of where he's at.
So is it just me, or those of you that have been doing this a little bit longer, I mean, 10 years ago, this was a rare patient, right? Or am I just too naive, because I wasn't really doing it as much 10 years ago? Just seems like now we see these patients constantly that are just out of control over some substance. So good job on documenting, and I know we've pushed it before, whenever we use ketamine, we need to say why, not just, oh, we gave some ketamine because he was being crazy. We said there were so many people involved. And the reason that is, and this is becoming less and less, when we first started using ketamine, I know I got calls and texts from local doctors. I know that Chad and other folks got calls and texts. Why are you crews giving this ketamine? You shouldn't be using this. It's a bad drug, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to have the stuff to defend that. So whenever we can pull a chart and say, well, it took 4 guys and 3 officers, what do you want me to do? You know, if we hold them down, we're going to break wrist. Our guys are going to get punched or hurt. Ketamine's a good, safe drug. Also good, in this case, we recognize that sometimes ketamine, although theoretically it shouldn't decrease breathing, it does sometimes. So we have to watch that and recognize that. And my favorite part of this is, you notice what happened at the hospital? The same folks that, I don't know, 2-3 years ago were fussing at us using ketamine. What did they finally give? Ketamine, right? They gave Ativan, they screwed around with everything else, and then they finally gave ketamine. So we've talked before that we really can drive care. Probably that same physician or whoever was doing that, if we weren't giving ketamine, I bet they would have never given the ketamine. So that's one of the things that I think is really cool about EMS, is we can drive care, and ketamine's becoming a standard. If you go to any conferences, read journals, ketamine is the drug for folks like this, not Ativan, not Versed.
Okay, now our favorite the synthetics. Now, my opinion is we are seeing less synthetics, a little bit. I don't think we've made a lot of headway. The state of Texas has been very aggressive now with charging these people, especially talked to one of the NARC officers Thursday night, and he said that they continue to bust the smoke shops on a regular basis. They're still selling it hot and heavy. And no, it's not a Scooby snack. So synthetic marijuana or synthetics is usually packaged in silvery containers. They're very flashy. So is what we're seeing right now is typically it's about 500 grams in a Scooby snack. And it takes 50 grams to get high, so you get 10 highs, and it's running about $80 to $88 right now. So it's a pretty cheap, you can't buy weed for that on the street. And so a lot of people are turning to these drugs. One of the things is these are different plants that are chopped up, that are made fine, and they're sprayed with all types of chemicals. That's just it. We don't know what it's being sprayed with, so it's very hard for us to treat this. A lot of these drugs are similar to THC or mind-altering drugs, like marijuana now. The only thing is, when it's being mixed all together, we're not getting a marijuana effect. How many times have you been to a fight from a marijuana party and everybody was fighting and wanting to fight you? I haven't been to one of those. So all the ones we go to are the ones where they're smoking the synthetics and the fight's on. I had to stop the audio on this because you can only imagine the words that were being associated with this. This young man had been smoking synthetics for a while, evidently, and the bugs are crawling on him. And we've seen this in town. We've seen this tweaker that is walking and he's scratching. This video goes on for a very, very long period of time. I mean, he makes his way all the way down the street scratching and then starts to come back here in just a little bit. But whatever's getting him is obviously something very large. The chupacabra is getting him badly. And he's elected to tell everybody about it.
Just comment, although that video is great to see, don't anyone in here ever take that video, right? We're professionals, we're out there working, and hopefully this was some bystander, but us as healthcare professionals,
this
should not make those videos.
Bystander video.
I think that's a fireable offense at everybody's institution here.
The bad thing about these synthetics is we don't know what it's sprayed with. We don't know what the compound of the plants that they are using. Anything is possible. Is what they're going for is a euphoric high. So they're trying just to reach that, remember what I said before, they're trying to get to that very first high again, and they're not able to get there. The spectrum is, what is most calls we see with these? Seizures. Their brain just says, I can't do this, they begin to seize. The packets are cheap, they're easy to get, and they don't trip a drug screen. This young man, Connor, is a 19-year-old male. Mom she has made this her passion because she lost her baby. And some of y'all may have seen this on the internet. She has made a huge campaign. He took one hit of K2 and ended up dying. He ended up herniating his brain. Pressure got too high, couldn't handle it, and he ended up dying within about 16 hours off of one hit of K2. Now, what K2 was that? K2 was kind of the original bath salt that we saw, but it's still very popular, and I'm sure it's changed prescriptions is really not the word, changed chemical compounds many times. But you can see this young man lost his life secondary to this K2 stuff. Unfortunately, we've had this kid in Lubbock. Not this kid, but we've had very similar situations of one hit, and they have lost their life due to that. So let's look at a case about an 80-kilo male. So not just super big, but what do these folks have? Superpower. And so, you get there and they want to fight, they want to scrap. He's in his mid-20s. I'm now in my mid-40s. I don't fight like I did when I was 20. It's a lot dirtier now, but I just don't last near as long as I used to. So we've got to kind of get this over quick. The patient's brother and girlfriend stated that they both lived at the residence. Both of them left for a while, came back, and he was coloring the walls with a marker and not making any sense. He states that the patient was lucid before they left, states that he has not been sleeping very much over the last 4 days, which ought to be a key that something's going on. He states he does have severe depression. They did not know that he does any illicit drugs. Well, somebody's up for 4 days at my house. Yeah, come on, you got to know, but I understand what they're going to say here. They verbally stated that the patient does use UMC, and that's where they'd like to go. Law enforcement states that when they arrived, the patient was screaming, sweating, extremely sweating, and was combative. The patient was placed in handcuffs and restrained at that point. So he's yelling, and he's not responding to verbal commands, thrashing around. The patient did look that someone but does not communicate. So he would recognize, and then he yells and begins to go back into a gaze. And then once again, a great job, 3 to 4 providers to hold him down. Now, he wasn't just a big guy, so 3 to 4 may help at least get him down, depending on how well the crew is holding. They elected to go with the ketamine at this point, 320 milligrams. And once again, now it's 3 to 5 providers to restrain him, and he's aggressive during the administration process. 2130, and that was 2131. 2136, he remains alert. Post-ketamine continues to yell, however, did decrease in swinging and thrashing. So you can see it's really starting to take place in work. They're able to get him to the cot. They get the heart monitor on him. They get out to the truck. And blood pressure, once again, true sign, elevated. Heart rate elevated, which is not horribly bad. Sometimes he's in mid-180s, 190s. 50 on his respirations and rapid. And then once again, guys, I can't stress this enough, the gold standard to where in case the young man dies, they can always say he was breathing with EMS, and we've documented everything very well. Pupils were once again dilated. He's extremely diaphoretic. They got oxygen on him, give that supplemental O2 to get a 12 lead, got an IV in place. Fluids, and then in transport, the patient begins to thrash, scream, and is not responding to anything and attempt to calm him down. So they use that verbal judo, and then here we go. We got the fight on again, so we have to go to another dose of ketamine. Now they have an IV established, so they cut their dose down to the 2 mils per key, which is going to be 180. Saturations, once again, remain with the gold standard for keeping those respirations being proven. So you remain sedated on the cot. Intact respirations were at a slowed rate. So, I mean, 50, you can't, I mean, I don't know too many adults that can breathe much faster than that. But I'm sure it could be done. And then they transferred to the facility on arrival. So the patient, the follow-up at the hospital, responding to EC staff, but was unable to recall the events. He was positive for cannabis, and the head CT was negative. The patient was admitted for marijuana use, and was stated that he was smoking some cheap pot. That is what a lot of people think is a synthetic marijuana, and it's cheaper. And it is cheaper than regular marijuana, as we talked about before. It cost him about $50, and as you can see, that he was just kind of curious. So he's used that weed and offered gateway drugs to move forward. He was observed and to rule out schizophrenia at some point. I guess that's what they kind of have to do. That evening on the floor, he kept trying to leave despite his family's redirection to the room. During the morning psychiatric assessment, he became very violent, was whispering with tight lips, and was talking to himself that there was demons in the room. There was 4 demons in the room, and he tried to choke his brother. So you can only imagine what he got. He was sedated at that point. Once again, we don't know what he used for sedation. They moved him back to the ICU for 3 days, where he was coherent, cooperative, and mildly disillusional. Sunrise Canyon was full. The plaza said, no, you don't meet the requirements, so they sent him home with his parents with an outpatient basis.
Good job again documenting on the ketamine, noticing the repeat dose, and I think any charts we look at, we're always doing good at that. Ken already, for likely the weed, the cheaper pot was probably synthetic, or we're seeing even occasionally the marijuana they're spraying with whatever the stuff is that they're soaking the other stuff is. So a rule I learned once in residency is know your drug dealer, know what you're buying, know if you're buying weed, buy the real stuff. But marijuana doesn't cause all this. Can't really endorse marijuana use, but marijuana doesn't kill people, synthetics do. I think marijuana has long-term effects, just like smoking, but keep that in mind. Any questions?
So one of the big things with these synthetics is that you order them online. They're very easy to get. Google it on your phone. I wouldn't do it at the station computer. For us or you guys, I don't think that would show up very well. Your administration might get a phone call. But you can buy them online, very cheap. Fentanyl, carfentanil, ketamine's available online now. Guys, I can't stress enough, the carfentanil, be careful. A lot of times you don't know what you're getting into. We are looking at what the options are for our K9 units. In case they get it, they have a very sensitive nose, you can give them Narcan. We're kind of looking at how we can help the police department out in case an officer, one of the K9s gets into it. Guys, if you see something in a baggie, leave it sealed. I would leave it up to the police department, let them be the canaries, and see what it is, because in today's world, you just don't know. You've seen time and time again of officers going down, stopping breathing. It doesn't take a lot of this stuff to do that. The bad thing is, fentanyl and ketamine, the grade that you can buy online illegally is better than the grade we have medically. And so it's amazing to see how pure this substance is. It's just astronomically crazy how well it works. All right, so any questions? Talk about the quiz and get you guys out of here.